All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm sure folks will still be filtering in. But this is our second presentation, Importance of Local Ecotype Plants in the Heartland. Our presenter is Lance Brisbois. Lance is the Deputy Director at Golden Hills, starting with the organization in 2014. Lance grew up in Harrison County, has a bachelor's degree in urban studies from the University of Minnesota, and a master's of public administration from the University of Nebraska-Omaha. Lance leads a variety of projects focusing on land stewardship and outdoor recreation and assists with daily operations. He's on the board of directors for the Iowa chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, Iowa Prairie Network, Pottawattamie County Trails Association, and chair of the Loess Hills Alliance Stewardship Committee. Lance lives in the Loess Hills and enjoys spending as much time outdoors as possible. Lance will also be manning the Golden Hills Vendor Table. Golden Hills is a 501c3 nonprofit working to collaboratively develop and lead community, conservation, and cultural initiatives to improve our quality of life in rural western Iowa. Goals include developing industries in local communities that utilize local resources, ensuring healthy natural resources that meet the needs of agriculture, industry, private use, and recreational facilities, promoting and enhancing art, culture, and historic resources in rural communities, collaborating with local governments and organizations on projects that benefit the environment, and working on projects that fill gaps in community services to benefit people of Southwest Iowa. They achieve a lot. So, welcome, Lance. Oh gosh, we didn't even have you pulled up, did we? I apologize. Okay, this one's you and presenter. Okay, there we go.
Okay, I'm just gonna stand here, so hopefully you can hear me okay. I'll try to speak into the mic. This is just a little bit of what we do at Golden Hills. I'll talk first about Golden Hills, and I'll talk generally about prairies and the ecosystems and biomes in this part of the world, and then specifically places where you can go to see prairies, and I'll talk about some specific species of native plants, and then a little bit more about Golden Hills in general. So Laurel kind of covered this, but these are our main program areas. I think prairies can fit into, native plants can fit into a lot of these, but primarily land stewardship. So we work throughout western Iowa, officially 12 counties in the southwest corner, but some of our work extends beyond that, including our work in the Loess Hills goes all the way up to Plymouth County, which is north of Sioux City. So I'll start with a prairie. A lot of you probably know this, but Iowa and Nebraska are part of the tallgrass prairie region, and prairie is basically a grassland. The word prairie is French for meadow, and I like these images found online, but there's a continuum from prairie to woodland, and so a lot of what we would have had here originally was prairie, but there would have been also some savannas, and certain areas, especially in like the steep kind of ravine areas in the hills, there would have been more woodland and some small forest areas. This is a map of the three main types of prairie. We're kind of in eastern Nebraska here on the western edge of the tallgrass prairie. If you go farther west, it's drier, and then you get into the mixed grass, which includes some tallgrass and some shortgrass species. And then farther west, just to the east of the Rockies, is more shortgrass. And those names are pretty descriptive. If you go to Iowa, for example, in the wetter parts of the Midwest, the grasses, especially like big blue stem and Indian grass, are pretty tall, often 6-8 feet plus. You go out to the western plains, the prairie species, the grasses are generally pretty short, maybe knee high. So as you go from the mountains to the east, basically it goes from drier to wetter. So those tallgrass species prefer slightly more wet environments. So the tallgrass prairies, in some cases, would have had hundreds of species of plants, and then many more hundreds of animals, including insects, birds, reptiles, mammals. But breaking down the prairie into plant types, primarily grasses and sedges. So a lot of the native grass species are warm seasons, so they do the majority of their growth during the warmer months. There are some native cool season grasses, like Canada wildrye is a good one that's fairly common and well known. And those tend to start growing earlier in the spring, and then they grow in the fall also a little bit. And then sedges are plants that look like grass, and to a lot of people they would just call it a grass, but they are a different family. But those three make up the majority of the grassland or prairie ecosystem. But then there would also be a decent number of forbs, which are flowering plants, and a lot of those flowering plants are legumes, not all of them, and then some shrubs too. So wild plum is one that comes to mind. Like, you would find those on the tallgrass prairie, just not in major quantities or large areas. So mostly grasses and sedges would be what constitutes a prairie. And then I think it's cool to think about that, how many species there were, lots of grasses, lots of legumes, and then anybody have a guess on what these maps are? So the one on the left is the corn belt. So that's where the darker green is where more corn is grown. The one on the right is soybeans. So you can see here the tallgrass prairie, many grasses and sedges replaced by one grass, basically, since corn fits into the grass family. So I think it's just an interesting map to look at. You can see it does extend a little farther west into Nebraska because of irrigation, but for the most part, the corn belt is what the tallgrass prairie region was. And since I'm based in Iowa, most of my maps are going to be Iowa, but it's pretty similar for eastern Nebraska. The map on the left shows the prairies in yellow. The map on the right shows, again, the prairies in yellow, but the gray is cropland, primarily corn and soybeans. So you can see most of that prairie is gone, and most of the prairie is now row crop. There are some, southern Iowa does still have more pastures, and it's hard to see on this map because it's such a narrow band, but the Loess Hills do have some slivers of prairie too. Iowa is the most physically altered or least natural state in the country. It's one of the least natural landscapes in the world. So 85% of Iowa was prairie, roughly. And then, like I said, there were wetlands and woodlands too. But this little postage stamp that you can see on the right side map is what's left. If all of the prairies in Iowa were combined into one spot, that's what's left. So in addition to the precipitation that I mentioned being a main factor in where the grasslands evolved, grazing and fire were huge components of prairies. So the photo on the bottom is from the Nature Conservancy. That is their property in the very northern Loess Hills, called Broken Kettle Grasslands. That is the largest remnant prairie left in Iowa. And they do have a herd of bison there. And it's open to the public. Often the bison are not close to the road, so you don't always see them, but it's still a beautiful place to drive through. It's on the northern end of the Loess Hills National Scenic Byway. So you can ride around up there. There are a few small areas where you can hike, not in the bison pasture, obviously, but bison, there were millions of them across North America, and basically they just walk around and eat. So they would keep the woody vegetation out of the prairies by eating it. And then a lot of the prairie species, the grasses and forbs, evolved with the bison there, so they were used to it and they thrived when the bison were there. And there were also fires regularly. So native people started fires for a variety of reasons, and lightning would sometimes start fires as well. So the intervals here were typically somewhere between 2 and 5 years, I think is kind of the general consensus. So pick a random spot in Iowa or eastern Nebraska, there was probably historically a fire once every few years. And again, that would keep the trees and shrubs limited because the native species, the grasses and forbs, thrived with that fire and with that grazing, and the trees don't like it as much. Bur oak is one somewhat fire tolerant species, so that would have been the most common, especially in the Loess Hills. But for the most part, prairies. It was grasses and forbs because of grazing and fire. I'll talk about a few examples of different landforms and types of prairies around here. So a remnant, I mentioned that before. A remnant is a prairie that has never been plowed, so it's close to its pre-European settlement condition, about as close as you can get at least. And then a restoration is one, a lot of times it's a pasture where it wasn't plowed, but it was planted with non-native grasses like brome or fescue. And so those have taken over, but there are still some native plants in there. So a restoration is when you go in and try to get rid of those invasive species and restore it back to more of its natural state. And a reconstruction is where you build a prairie from scratch. So that could be a corn or soybean field or a lawn, something that has no prairie left that you plant into a prairie. So in Iowa, 99.9% of the prairies are gone. But of that 0.1%, more than half is in the Loess Hills. So we're lucky in the western part of Iowa that we do have relatively large prairies left. I want to talk about the landforms, and I have some maps coming up too, but wet prairies are obviously wetter. They tend to be in low-lying areas where moisture can stand. Mesic is in between, so a lot of the hillsides that aren't super steep would be a mesic prairie. And then dry prairies are common more in the Loess Hills, especially on the steepest slopes. And I've mentioned the Loess Hills, you probably all heard of them, but it's a narrow band of hills following the Missouri River. Technically, the ecosystem or the landform that is defined as the Loess Hills is only in Iowa, but you do have Loess Hills on the Nebraska side. They're just not as steep and deep. So the Loess Hills of Iowa are considered their own landform, but Nebraska does have Loess Hills also. And then the Missouri River floodplain, you've all driven across that, just flat bottomland. That would have been a lot of wetlands and oxbows, so that would have been wet prairies. And then southern Iowa drift plain is when you get east of the Loess Hills. It's still pretty steep rolling hills, but not as steep as the Loess Hills. And then there's sun and shade. Obviously, a lot of you know that if you garden. There's some species love full sun, some like a mix, some like more shade. This picture I included is at Hitchcock Nature Center, so you can kind of see a few examples. The foreground is more prairie. That hill in the back, they've done a bunch of clearing, and so that's more of what I would call a savanna. It was more overgrown with woody species, and they've cut back a bunch, so there is still some sunlight reaching the ground. So that'd be savanna, and then more to the right, that's more of a woodland or forest where there's very little sunlight reaching the ground, very shady in there. And then you can't really see it here, but on the left of this photo is a pond, and so that would be along the edge of that more wetland and wet species. So this is the ecoregions. These maps are from the EPA. This is just the 4-state region, and this is kind of a zoomed in version. So 47M here is the Loess Hills, and that's primarily what I'm talking about. But as I mentioned, 47H is the Nebraska and Kansas Loess Hills, so very similar. And then 47D is the Missouri floodplain. 47E, like I said, basically as you go east of the Loess Hills, it's still steep. And then as you go farther east in Iowa, it gets less steep, but still has a lot of deep loess soil. And then 47I here on the Nebraska side is loess and glacial drift hills. So that's pretty similar to a lot of southern Iowa. So who cares? We lost the prairie. Iowa has lost 50% of its topsoil. You may have heard in the news a lot of water quality issues that's affecting public health. These maps show soil erosion in 1982 compared compared to 2012. So the darker the color, the worse the erosion. And it's basically where the Loess soil is are the worst places for soil erosion. There's eastern Washington has the Palouse Prairie region. They have a lot of soil erosion, and then the parts of western Iowa, eastern Nebraska, and then down along like the east side of the Mississippi River. There's places with deep loess too, so that's where the soil erosion is the worst. But this is kind of promising that compared to 1982, it is less bad. So there's a lot of conservation practices on farmland that have been implemented in the last 30 or so years that have reduced the soil erosion. But we still have a lot of soil erosion, partly just because of there's no prairie left, and the prairies have really deep roots that keep that soil in place. Now we have a 2-crop system that the crops are there half of the year, and then it's bare soil for half the year. And a lot of you know this already, found this chart online, but without the prairies, we don't have the pollinators either. So your little backyard garden does make a difference, but on such a large scale with so little prairie left, we need to restore some of that habitat in order to get to revive our pollinator populations. I thought this was a sad but funny cartoon. I'm in my 30s. I remember in the 90s when we would drive around at night, the windshield would be covered with bugs, and now you don't see that very much. So that's a very anecdotal thing, but the numbers, the science proves it too. And then not only do the insect populations decline, but all the species that rely on insects for food also decline, including birds. Grassland birds specifically are experiencing the greatest loss of any bird habitat. So, and I mentioned water quality. The red on here shows impaired waters in Iowa. So it's more than half of it. Most of the waters in Iowa are impaired. And again, prairies and native plants have a lot of benefits for water quality. This is wells and community water supplies. Again, not great. So native plants have, a lot of species of native plants have very deep roots, and that helps filter the water and helps it absorb into the soil, reduces erosion, improves water quality, also can reduce flooding impacts, and then it provides wildlife habitat as well. Prairie strips are a fairly new practice that have been implemented in agricultural landscapes. It requires taking about 10% of a farm field, planting it into prairies that are strategically placed to capture soil and nitrogen and phosphorus runoff. The research has shown that there's 42% less runoff, 95% less soil erosion, 89% less phosphorus, and 84% less nitrogen. So nitrogen and phosphorus are the two nutrients that are applied to crop fields as fertilizer primarily. And when it's not absorbed by the plants, then it goes into the water and into the soil. So prairie strips are one of the best practices that can be implemented to reduce that runoff and those nutrients and improve water quality. Soil health as well. These are the soil health principles. Again, just putting this in here because prairies and native plants have the ability to improve all of these. This is kind of on a smaller scale, more urban setting. We did several rain gardens and bioretention cells in a few different communities in southwest Iowa. This one is in Malvern, but the rooftop has gutters that go into these, and then the water is filtered so it comes out cleaner into the streams. It reduces the temperature of the water too, which is beneficial for fish and aquatic life. And like I said, the deep roots really help pull the water in, so it can even, if we had a lot of these all over, it would help reduce flash flooding as well. So I mentioned the Loess Hills. I'll talk a little bit more about them. More than 200 miles from north of Sioux City, following the Missouri River, and they go all the way down into Missouri. Golden Hills coordinates the Loess Hills National Scenic Byway, which is 200 plus miles. There's what we call the spine, which is all paved roads, and then there's some optional excursion loops that include gravel routes. The Loess Hills are highly erodible. These are some photos of soil erosion in the Loess Hills. The one on the right or on the left is a road, so a lot of times roads were cut into the hills to make it easier to get through. One interesting thing about the Loess is that if it's cut completely vertically, it can stand for a while and doesn't erode, but if it's at any kind of angle, then it cuts really deep. So these are just a couple examples. Partly also because most of the streams, including the Missouri, were channelized. That caused the elevation to change, and so the streams all had to cut down in order to level out with the floodplain. So most of the streams in western Iowa and a lot in eastern Nebraska have very deep cut banks, and they would not have looked like that 200 years ago. They would have been meandering streams with prairies, clear water, and just changing course all the time, creating oxbows and wetlands. So what we see is very different. I'll just run through these pretty quick, but these are photos I've taken. These are all places that are open to the public, so if you want to go see prairies, these are some good options. So starting in the north, north of Sioux City and Plymouth County, I mentioned Broken Kettle. That's the largest remnant. And then that is managed by the Nature Conservancy, which is a nonprofit. But like I said, you can drive in there, and there are some hiking areas, so that's open to the public. And then Sylvan Runkle Preserve is in Monona County, and that's a state wildlife area. So again, you can go hike around anytime. The Loess Hills Prairie Seminar is held there every year. It's a free, family-friendly event. It's a weekend-long educational programming. It's a great event. If you haven't heard of it, check it out. Hinda Hills is another wildlife area in Plymouth County that just opened a few years ago. Loess Hills State Forest has some of the largest remnants left in Iowa. It's called a state forest. There are forests there, but there's also a lot of remnant prairies. So more than 70 miles of hiking trails too. Some of them are very steep and challenging. Some of them are a lot easier. There's an overlook where you can just basically get out of your car and walk on a boardwalk. Murray Hill Scenic Overlook is in Harrison County. That's a good place to get just a quick overview, one of the most scenic photograph spots in the Loess Hills. A lot of you have probably been to Hitchcock. It's one of the closest ones to Omaha in the metro area. But Loess Hills State Forest has 4 different units. Those are all owned and managed by the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. Old Town Conservation Area is a county park in Harrison County, just south of Missouri Valley. Vincent Bluff is a remnant in the middle of Council Bluffs. It's kind of a hidden gem. Nobody knows about it, but it is a remnant. It was never plowed and just has remained protected because it was too steep to develop, but it does have a lot of issues with invasive species. It's managed by a nonprofit and volunteers. And you can hike around up in there and you can see downtown Omaha and the interstate and all the industry around, but it's this really unique little oasis in the middle of town. South in Fremont County is Waubonsee State Park. Lots of hiking there, and probably the best prairie is out on what's called Sunset Ridge in that photo. Green Hill is in Mills County, as is Folsom Point Preserve. They're right across the road from each other, just south of Council Bluffs, probably almost straight east of here. And Folsom Point is owned by the Nature Conservancy, and Green Hill is Iowa DNR. And then a little bit south in Mills County's West Oak Forest is a county park, and then Possum Hollow Wildlife Area is a state wildlife area. So all of those locations that I mentioned and more are on our Loess Hills hiking guide. So if you're interested in hiking, and like I said, you don't necessarily have to do a long hike. Some of them are pretty easily accessible from a vehicle, but almost all of these sites have remnant prairies. So if you're looking to go find some plants, these are good places to explore. Now I want to talk about a few unique species that are, for Iowa, pretty rare and only found in the Loess Hills. But if you go west, they're more common. And that's because of, like I mentioned, the unique topography of the Loess Hills and the well-drained soils. So Yucca glaucus, fairly common in some of the remnants in the Loess Hills. But as this map shows, you go east, you won't find it pretty much. But if you go west into the sandhills and places west of there, it is pretty common. It's a very dry tolerant species. Similarly, scarlet glow mallow. Few spots in the Loess Hills. It grows on very steep bluffs that are hard to access, but much more common out west. Cutleaf iron plant, again, common out west, even in the southwest, even in the desert, but in Iowa, the Loess Hills are really the easternmost place where you can find it. And that one, I just saw some blooming this morning. Just kind of starting to go to seed too. 9-anther dahlia. I think that's a really beautiful one. The stem turns bright red in the fall and has those bushy heads that just kind of glow in the sunlight. Again, fairly common in the Loess Hills, but then there's a gap in eastern Nebraska where it doesn't really grow. If you go farther west, you'll find it again. But then east of the Loess Hills, you won't find it. And then lotus milkvetch, another one, just barely any locations east of the Loess Hills, but pretty common out west. And skeleton weed. Just saw some of that this morning. Some of it was blooming, some of it was going to seed, but very called skeleton weed because it basically looks like a skeleton. Basically looks like bones. There's not much to the plant. Very thin stems. Doesn't really have leaves, but just gets these little flowers on it, and definitely more of a dry desert species. So these are some of the more common species, ones that I would say people like to plant in their gardens, and a lot of them have pollinator benefits. So common milkweed, you probably all know that one, but some people think it's a weed, but I think it's a beautiful flower, and monarchs need that one. Baptisia alba, or white wild indigo, that one's fairly common in the prairies. I do think the grasses are also beautiful, and if you look close, they do have little flowers. So Cytotes grama is a shorter one, but pretty common, especially around here. Echinacea or coneflower is pretty common too. We do have, especially places like Hitchcock, I know in the Loess Hills, Echinacea angustifolia is the most common one. A lot of times if you buy Echinacea at a nursery, it's probably purpurea, which isn't very common around here. So if you can find the angustifolia, I would recommend it. It might be more difficult to find, but that is the more common one locally. Rattlesnake master, rough blazing star, dotted blazing star, prairie blazing star. So I don't see the prairie blazing star a whole lot in the Loess Hills, but it seems common in a lot of other tallgrass prairies. The rough and dotted blazing stars are more common and blooming right about now, pretty late summer into the fall. And then rattlesnake master might be kind of hard to see, but has little spiky balls on it. Penstemon grandiflorus is one of the more common beard tongues. It has large flowers. It blooms in the spring. Gray-headed coneflower. Again, that's one where you might, you could probably find it in a lot of nurseries. It may not be the exact same species, or it may be a cultivar. So if you're able to get access to harvest seed, you could probably find some locally. That would be our local ecotype. Compass plant is one of my favorites. Gets really tall, has very deep roots. The leaves turn to orient so the sun during the hottest part of the day doesn't suck all the moisture out of the leaves, so they kind of turn north-south, so that's why it's called compass plant. So in the summer, if you find a plant, the leaves are probably oriented north-south. Blue-eyed grass, that one blooms pretty early in the spring. It looks like a grass, but it's not. It has little flowers on it. They're whitish to bluish, and it's pretty common, but that's one that can be more difficult to find the seed because it's short, and so when it goes to seed, all the other plants are coming up around it. But the really beautiful short one that if you're looking for a short species, that'd be a good one to get. These two are blooming now. These are later season. So stiff goldenrod, I like that one because of the red stems and leaves in the fall. And then ironweed is a nice purple flower. I mentioned the yucca before, but that's a photo of it blooming in the spring. Butterfly weed is the orange milkweed. And that one's pretty cool because there really aren't very many orange species around here in native prairies. Most of them are either purple or pink or yellow, so the orange really stands out. And Monarda, a bee balm, that's again another one where a lot of nurseries sell Monarda, but it may not be the same local ecotype that always grows around here. So if you're looking for more local ecotype, probably better to just go pick some seed if you can. And then wild rose or pasture rose, prairie rose, that's the state flower of Iowa, and it gets those rose hips on it that are, I've heard they have more vitamin C than an orange. And I don't want to forget about our native trees and shrubs, so I'm talking a lot about prairies, but we would have had trees and shrubs around here too, especially along our rivers and streams. A lot of, as I mentioned, partly because of channelization, when we straightened the rivers, a lot of the buffers were also removed, but restoring trees along our waterways is a really important practice for water quality and increasing wildlife habitat. Cottonwood sedge meadow, that photo is at DeSoto. That's kind of probably what a lot of the Missouri River floodplain would have looked like at one point. So a lot more trees and but pretty open still, so not dense forest, but a lot of cottonwoods with meadows underneath, and then bur oak savanna I mentioned. They're especially in the Loess Hills, the bur oaks would have been the more common tree species. It wouldn't have been a lot of dense woodlands, but just like kind of an oak here and there scattered around the prairie. I think the one on the left is wild plum. The one on the right is New Jersey tea. And then that photo in the middle is an example of what a oak savanna looks like. So if you're looking for seed, Golden Hills coordinates a bunch of events, mostly in the fall. That's kind of the peak prairie seed harvest season. We've been doing it for a few years now. Last year we had over 100 people attend, and I have an email list. You can come to my table. I can get you on that list if you're interested. We go out to remnant prairies and pick seed by hand. You don't have to have experience or knowledge. We'll show you what we're doing, what species we're targeting. If there are any invasives or species that we don't want to pick, we'll point those out too. Depending on where we are, some places allow people to take seed home. If we're at a county park, they usually do. If we go to a DNR property in Iowa, they don't allow people to take seed off-site. So in those cases, at the state parks and wildlife areas, we pick the seed and then it stays with the DNR, and they use it for their restoration projects. At county parks where they allow us to take the seed, then we have done these seed packets, and we also have a partnership with Iowa Western Community College where we've used their greenhouse to propagate some of the seeds and then have a native plant sale in the spring. So we've really been picking, honestly, whatever's available, but there are some species we're trying to get more of. So based on what the county conservation boards and the DNR want, if there's specific forbs that they're looking for. Also some of the less common species or ones that are harder to find and harvest. And some of those endemic Loess Hills species that I mentioned that aren't very common are some that we're targeting. And then some of the spring and summer species, like I said, usually we go out in the fall. There are definitely, as soon as April, there are flowers that are blooming. But then the prairie grows up around them, so it's a lot harder to find those. So I want to start getting more of the spring and summer species instead of just the fall ones. We've done a little bit in the savannas and woodlands, some of the, especially grasses like bottlebrush grass and silky wild rye, but we mostly stick to the prairies. And then sedges are another one. I think partly just because they're harder to find. I haven't had great luck harvesting sedge seed, but I'd like to get more of it. So this is the list of the seed harvest we have coming up, kind of right in the middle right now, but several opportunities, a couple at Hitchcock, and then some farther north and further south. So we may add one more, but kind of throughout the Loess Hills from north to south. Started in August, we'll go through late October. We've worked with Loess Hills State Forest, and we're going to be putting some, I think, at our office in Oakland too. Seed beds, like this, from seed that we picked, we grew native plants, we planted them in these raised beds, and then it's a little seed plot that's a lot more efficient to go harvest the seed, just in one little spot instead of roaming a prairie, which is super fun, but not an efficient use of time. So trying to get more of these smaller plots where you can just go strip the seed by hand really quick. And we've done some seed storage and cleaning and processing classes. I have one coming up at Hitchcock October 7th. So once we pick the seed, then what? Kind of go through how to clean it, how to sort it, how to store it, and then how to, if you're interested in germinating it, like in a greenhouse or high tunnel, how to do that. This is a resource that's free on our website. It's kind of an overwhelming spreadsheet, to be honest, because there's so much information, but it has a list of all the species that we know, all the plant species we know in the Loess Hills, and information about when they bloom, when the seed's ready. There's a little bit of color coding, like the green here are species that we definitely want to target for seed harvest. If there's a few invasive species that are listed that we are highlighted in red. Those are species we do not want to pick. But it shows plant family, soil moisture. If you scroll over to the right, it has a column that has information about the pollinators. So like I said, it can be overwhelming, but if there's a specific flower that you're wondering about, does it support certain pollinators, this is a good list to go find. Or if you want to have species that are blooming from April through October, you can look at the bloom times on this chart too. This is the list I put together a couple years ago. It's not about medicinal or edible uses of plants, but some other uses such as making rope or dyes or biofuels. So just a list of interesting ideas that people historically have used or could still use for native plants. For a few winters, we did starting during COVID, we did a series of webinars with Dr. Tom Rosberg. He's one of the premier experts of botany in Iowa, and these were all recorded. They were Zoom classes, and they're on our website to watch for free. But this is just one of the years that we did. So there's just different families is how we kind of broke it down for the most part. And then there was one about seedlings. We did one about invasive species and weed identification, one about fire ecology. So those are, the link is down there, goldenhillsrcd.org/plant ID. Good winter activity if you're looking for something to watch to learn about native plants. I mentioned this before, we work with Iowa Western. We've done the last few years grown native plants in a greenhouse with the seed, some of the seed that we picked during our fall seed harvest. And then we do a spring plant sale. This is the class October 7th. We're doing a series in partnership with Iowa Western about land stewardship. So it started in March. We've been doing one a month, and then we have 2 left now. But that it's $65, and like I said, the October one will be about processing and harvesting and cleaning the prairie seed. These are just a few links so Golden Hills has a lot of stuff on our website. Iowa Prairie Network is a nonprofit. I'm a board member of that, but it's a statewide group that works on just educating people to get and taking people out to prairies, doing prairie walks. A lot of good resources on their website to find a prairie, as well as information about managing prairies. And Tallgrass Prairie Center is at the University of Northern Iowa. Again, they have lots of free resources on their website. And then visit Loess Hills, that's the Scenic Byway website, and we have our hiking guide listed on there. That's it. That was a lot. Any questions?
All right, thank you, Lance. We are tight on time for the Q&A session, but we could entertain one or two. Otherwise, Lance will be out at the Golden Hills tables, so make sure that you stop by and visit him. I know I, for one, I'm going to do a family outing to Vincent Bluffs and the Broken Kettle, so those sound really amazing. Are there any questions for Lance right now? All right, sounds good. Be sure to stop by the Golden Hills table. Thank you, Lance.
Thank you.